Chapters 15 and 16. Well, welcome to the last session. Please hold those cheers of joy until we're at least finished. What's the old saying? You're going to miss me when I'm gone. Well, this session is perhaps the longest in terms of lectures, but that's because it's very important. We will extend our discussion from the last lecture and expand on employee rights and responsibilities and talk about unions and management relationships. I've noticed from the discussion forum that some of you are pro-union. You should find much to disagree with in this lecture, but that's okay. That's how we grow. I'll be interested to see your responses in the discussion forum this week. Remember, I don't worry a lot about offending people, although I hope you will find my comments intriguing rather than offensive. I speak freely and hope you can gain from a different perspective. More importantly, I hope you speak freely as well. I welcome dissent, and I know that there are a lot of you out there who have little experience with unions, so I hope you can learn from both sides rather than just mine. Also in the lecture, I talk a lot about rights in the workplace and how often we give up our rights freely. I hope you come away with a great appreciation of your rights, but also a better understanding of just how easily we give them up. Sometimes that's good and sometimes that's bad. Regardless, you should give up your rights consciously and cautiously. When I went into the military many years ago as a young man, I consciously surrendered many of my rights, but in return, I gained a much better appreciation of my rights and how I should hold them dear. They are precious to me, and although I still give them up, I do so sparingly and carefully. I mention this because I have never given up my rights completely to a company. When I commit to an employment contract, in other words, accept a job, I make sure that I understand what is expected of me and that I am in agreement with the culture, philosophy, and values of the organization. Under such circumstances, I relinquish some of my rights for a period of time to the organization. If the organization changes and I come to disagree with the direction or find it not to my liking, I reclaim my rights and I leave. I've never endured an employment environment that makes me uncomfortable or to which I disagree for long. Consequently, I've moved around a lot. But none of those organizations were doing things that were illegal or immoral. They were merely going in a direction I didn't want to go. Therefore, most importantly, I reserve the right to determine my own direction. I reserve the right to build my own career. I am in control of me, for good or bad. Sounds profound, doesn't it? Not really. I say this in this and in previous lectures that it's all about choices. I merely want to leave you with the thought that the choices are always yours, unless you give up the right to have others make those choices for you, and you maintain the right to choose by accepting the consequences of those choices for good and for bad. When you blame others, you effectively admit that you relinquished control of your life to someone or something else, and that you gave up the most important right of all, the right to choose. Thanks for choosing this class, and I hope the outcome has been a good one. Now let's explore rights, responsibilities, unions, and management. Chapters 15 and 16. In the last lecture, I made a connection between risk management and employee rights and responsibilities. As you may have noticed, the chapter on risk is largely devoted to defining and explaining the responsibilities of the employer towards employees and the community. Chapter 15 explains and defines the rights of both employees and employers. So, what do both of these topics have to do with unions? You see, anytime two parties enter into a contractual agreement, such as employment, rights and responsibilities exist on both sides. The same is true when a company, employees, and unions enter into contractual agreements. Many of these rights and responsibilities have been defined by laws and the courts and therefore change over time. Also, some rights are granted so that a party can meet their responsibilities and the rights of other parties are simultaneously restricted. I made this point in the last lecture with the example involving drug testing. An organization has a responsibility to protect employees and provide an environment as free from drugs as possible. It is very difficult for employers to meet that responsibility unless they are given the right to conduct drug testing. Therefore, the courts have afforded some latitude to employers to test for drugs and restricted some employee privacy rights in the process. Employee rights, on the other hand, are not as clearly codified and often prove risky for employers to take the proper action to ensure the rights of both company and employees are met. And often we get hung up on the right of an individual employee when the rights of all employees may hang in the balance. We also at times get mixed up with rights versus privileges. You don't have a right to drive. Driving is a privilege. Therefore, that privilege can be withheld. You have a right to free speech, but it too can be withheld under very limited circumstances. And you can relinquish rights yourself merely by signing them away. I referred to that document earlier. It's called a contract. Let me give you an example. I worked at a company that had all employees sign non-compete agreements and confidentiality agreements. The nature of the non-compete agreement depended upon the position held by the employee, but the confidentiality agreements were somewhat standard for all employees. A sales manager resigned from the company, and we found out a short time later that he went to work for a competitor. Such action was forbidden by the non-compete agreement. We also discovered that non-compete agreements are difficult and sometimes impossible to enforce in certain states. This individual went to work in a state that didn't recognize non-compete agreements. Much to our dismay, we found that customer information and other data from our company was showing up with customers in other areas. Significant portions of our confidential data had been stolen. All signs pointed to the sales manager who left. We investigated and determined that he had downloaded to his personal computer all of our customer lists, pricing information, and new product designs the day before he left. He took this proprietary information to his new employer to use against us. This was strictly against the confidentiality agreement he had signed and was an act of industrial espionage on the part of his new employer. He had a right to leave, but not with our information. The question centered on what to do with the individual and the company. My position, without hesitancy, was to prosecute to the fullest extent of the law and put people in jail if possible. If jail wasn't an option, we should ensure that financial penalties were strong and harsh. As it turned out, pursuing my course of action, our old sales manager was financially ruined, and his new employer was forced to pay hefty fines and agree to other restrictions in business practice that were very costly. I made the decision to not show leniency to the former sales manager because we had a responsibility to protect our employees and their jobs. The information stolen from our company placed every job in our organization at risk. The information was devastating to our company and would have surely impacted sales and competitive advantage in the near future. We needed to send a message that such illicit behavior would not be tolerated from anyone. Our responsibility was clearly to our current employees and not to a former sales manager. Now, this may sound clear-cut to all of you, but there were many voices in the organization begging for mercy for the sales manager. He was employed for nearly 15 years. He was a nice guy. He worked hard for us. But our current employees needed to know that we would go to great lengths to protect their futures. And anyone else or any other competitor contemplating such actions needed to understand the consequences. A similar situation occurred when I worked for Nestle, and I was on the other side of the situation. We hired an engineer who was laid off from Kraft Foods, our major competitor. He was instrumental in developing the manufacturing process for their product, which competed with us. We understood that he had both a confidentiality agreement and a non-compete agreement in force. Instead of trying to ignore these agreements, we contacted Kraft Foods and explained our desire to hire the engineer before hiring and agreed to sign documents ourselves pledging that we would seek nor accept confidential information. and we honored that commitment diligently. Also note for your own purposes, and I don't believe this is mentioned in the text, non-compete agreements have limited use. Confidentiality agreements, on the other hand, are recognized as valid in all states and in most countries of the world as well. An organization's right to restrict employment movement as to competitors is not universally accepted. However, an organization's right to maintain certain information confidential is widely accepted and defensible. Often the rights we have are defined by the rights we have given up. That is true in our career and business lives as well as our personal lives. At the risk of getting on my soapbox again, we are blessed with so many more rights in this country than people in other parts of the world. We choose to give them up to bureaucrats, politicians, unions, and others. We trade them like currency. We trade this right for a little security. We trade that right for a little convenience. We trade another right for a lack of worry or a measure of certainty. Are you willing to trade the uncertainty of variable and perhaps no pay increase, pay for performance, for the certainty of across-the-board increases or cost of living increases? Are you willing to trade the uncertainty of promotion based on performance and potential for the certainty of promotion based on seniority? If so, you have lost the right of self-determination in your career. This is particularly true in unions, which we will get to later in this lecture. While working at RCA, I had a young man come to me and complain that he had taken numerous courses in maintenance, had become certified in electronics and other trade functions, and still could not get into the maintenance department due to his relatively low seniority. He was about 150 on the list of people who wanted into this high-paying job. All in front of him on the seniority list had no or little formal maintenance qualifications. I told him there was nothing I could do short of advising him to get a maintenance job at a different company. Our union contract required seniority promotions in all positions, including maintenance. Employees at RCA gave up their right to self-determination in their career for the certainty of seniority promotions. When you move into some neighborhoods, you're required to belong to a homeowners association. You elect to pay dues for such a privilege, and in return, you must get permission to paint your house, determine when to cut your grass, and many other aspects of living that are controlled by the homeowners association. To be sure, you will get certain benefits from the homeowners association, a union, or the government. So I'm not saying it is necessarily bad. But you give up freedoms and rights as a consequences. Once again, it's a choice. RCA was a unionized company. They had the most onerous and even ridiculous attendance policy imaginable. They paid way too much money for the skills they required. The work rules and restrictions on management were unmanageable. And all of these came from the union? No, they all came from management. You see, all of these are management rights which were given up to employees and the union. The union asks for things, well, maybe threatens is a better description, and the company grants those things. The company chooses to give up certain rights in exchange for a prompt and peaceful contract negotiation. When we contractually agree to something, we give up our rights. The lesson? When someone says RCA lost control of their business, that's false. They didn't lose control, they gave it up. They relinquished control. And we relinquish control ourselves anytime we enter into a contractual agreement. Again, I'm not saying it's bad, and indeed, at times it can be very good. It can be a good trade to give up rights for some other thing of value, especially if you value that thing more than those rights and freedoms. In my life, I traded certain rights and freedoms for automobiles, houses, money for education. Oh, and the most important one, marriage. You see, that's a contractual agreement too. Like I said, some of these trade-offs are good. By the way, my wife is looking over my shoulder right now, so it is an excellent trade-off. Chapter 15 talks extensively about the erosion of employment at will and other legal doctrines defining the rights of employees and employers. Although the law states through employment at will that employees and employers both have the right to terminate the employment arrangement at any time, That is no longer true for the employer. To terminate the employment arrangement, the employer must have just cause and have that cause documented fully. In addition, the employer must take certain steps to terminate the arrangement and must do so in a specific manner. The employee merely has to come in and say, "I quit." Pay particular attention to the material in the text defining employment at will, public policy exemption, implied contract exemption, good faith and fair dealing exemption, wrongful discharge, constructive discharge, and due process. These concepts are important and should be understood by all in leadership positions. The final section of Chapter 15 deals with discipline and discharge of employees. They also deal with discharging potentially violent employees. Let me give you an example of one such case that related to both rights and responsibilities of the company and employees. A supervisor came to me one evening stating that a female employee complained that a male employee was staring at her. My immediate thought was, oh no, here comes another dispute between male and female employees, between people in romantic relationships. Nevertheless, such a complaint must be addressed, so I asked him to bring the female to my office. When questioned about how he was staring at her, she indicated that he would stand within 3 feet of her and just stare nonstop during his entire break and lunch period. She indicated that he said nothing, only stared. It had been going on for a few days, and as you might imagine, was unnerving for her. I inquired if she had any kind of a relationship with him and said she didn't even know his name. It sure sounded unusual to me. I asked the supervisor to bring the male employee to my office. At this time, it was about 8 p.m. at night. Both employees were on second shift. It was dark outside and the office was deserted, save for me. The male employee walked in and calmly sat down. I confronted him with the accusation, and he freely admitted staring at the young lady. I asked him why he did it, and he calmly once again stated, "She belongs to me." I asked who gave her to him, and he stated, "The devil gave her to me. She's mine, and no one will take her away." It was an interesting dilemma. I was here by myself and a potentially violent employee sitting across from me at the desk. I pointed out that staring was against company policy and I would need to conduct an investigation. I asked him to go home and report back to me in 3 days. He once again calmly asked, "You're not going to fire me, are you? Because if you do, the devil wouldn't like that. It wouldn't be a good thing for you to do." I told him that I didn't know what I would do, and that was the purpose of the investigation. However, if he reported back to me in 3 days, I would give him an answer. I also cautioned that he should leave now and let me get started. He left, and I ensured that he got in his car and left the premises. His behavior was truly bizarre, and I knew I had to get him out of our workplace immediately. However, termination of employment that night was premature. I needed time to plan and ensure that no violence took place. I called the young lady back in, along with her supervisor, and explained the situation. She was single and lived alone in an apartment. I also told her I suspected the male employee knew where she lived and had been stalking her for a while. I suggested she find someone to go home with and stay there for the 3 days. I gave her an option of staying off work during that time or working as usual, and we would ensure he didn't get in the facility. I strongly advised her to not be alone during that time. I also provided her an escort to go home and to pack her things that evening. She made arrangements to stay with a co-worker and left her car in the parking lot for the duration of the 3 days. She would spend the next 3 days with the co-worker and her family, which would provide a safe environment. The next day, I contacted the local police and explained the situation. We planned to terminate the employment of the individual, and given the opportunity, the police would arrest him to protect the young lady and obtain the medical assistance he so badly needed. On the 3rd day, I arranged for several of my large male friends in the plant to work late and work near my office. When the young man came in, I had a brief meeting and explained that I had to terminate his employment due to violation of our policy against the hostile work environment. He was not happy, but he offered no resistance. He calmly got up and walked out the door, got in his car, and drove away. The police followed him directly to the young lady's apartment. They arrested him, and he received the care he needed at the state mental hospital. Now, this story is important because it demonstrates the organization's right to control the workplace and its responsibility to employees to maintain a safe work environment. It also demonstrates that our responsibility to our employees sometimes goes well beyond the walls of our organization. I had a responsibility to ensure the young lady was safe at work, but also at home. I had a responsibility to ensure the young man received the treatment he needed, even though I used an unorthodox way to accomplish that end. I also realized that legal problems may ensue since a young man could be considered disabled by his mental condition. However, my first responsibility was to the safety of the employees in the workplace, and the legal issues would be of concern later. They never did come up. Rights and responsibilities are complex issues. We freely choose to give up some of our rights, but desperately cling to others. And what we choose to give up and defend is different from individual to individual and organization to organization. However, we should never confuse rights with what is right. And sometimes it is right to mitigate or disregard the rights of individuals to ensure we meet our responsibilities and safeguard the rights of others. Giving up rights is not a bad thing, but it should be a conscious thing. It should be a choice. What rights have you given up? What rights are you willing to give up? When do your or others' rights come into conflict with your responsibilities? Notice these questions are not framed as possibilities. They're certainties. You have given up and will give up rights, and your rights and responsibilities will come into conflict. Once again, it's all about choices. The title of Chapter 16 is Union Management Relations. That's important. The title is not unions. Unions and management are adversaries in the vast majority of situations in which they interact. It's like those pictures you see on the internet of a lion and a lamb or a dog and a cat cuddling lovingly together and showing great care and affection to one another. We all know that that is a one in a million situation. In the vast majority of situations, you put a lamb and a lion, only one's coming out. Well, I guess they both come out, but the lamb isn't in the same condition as when it walked in, and the lion is no longer hungry. Unions and management are more like the dog and the cat. They are evenly matched, and if they both walk out, they don't look the same. And there's a decent chance that neither will walk out. They may harm each other. Now, I realize that this sounds like a pretty dark and dreary picture, and often it is. But take heart. Unions and management have been living together for decades, and even though they harm one another once in a while, they basically learn to coexist, albeit with an uneasy truce. When in management circles, you hear the common criticism of unions as such. All they do is set up bureaucracies. They only really protect bad employees. They drive pay up. They create unreasonable work rules. They interfere with an organization's ability to compete. They spread ill will and distrust. They drive companies out of business. And those are the nice things managers say. And I'm sure you hear similar criticisms of management in union circles. Managers only care about money. Managers only protect their favorites. Managers drive pay down. Managers create unreasonable work rules. Managers don't respect or trust employees. Managers are only concerned about the company and profits. And having worked on both the union side and management side, I must say that both of the criticisms are partially true in some organizations. What is interesting is that in this adversarial relationship, both sides tend to lose sight of reality and focus on the negative and conflict. In so doing, they establish organizations that are highly bureaucratic, high-paid, with unreasonable work rules, sometimes uncompetitive, full of distrust, and on the edge of business viability. They become what they abhor. They are so focused on each other that they lose sight of the one thing that will drive success, the customer. I think a great contemporary example of this is our school system and a teachers union. We hear a lot about teacher pay and benefits, but we don't, in my opinion, hear enough about effectiveness of teachers and the quality of education for our children. The teachers union is strongly against pay for performance for teachers. Do we have the best teachers? What happens when bad teachers don't perform? Basically nothing. They continue to teach. What about the customer? What about the student? In addition, I talk to many teachers who are very dissatisfied with their working environment. Not enough resources to teach effectively, not enough support from administration, no consequences for bad teachers or bad administrators, etc. Ask yourself a question. Have teachers' unions made the schools better? Have teacher unions made the situation for teachers better? Have teacher unions improved the education our children are receiving? To be sure, teacher unions are not solely to blame for the situation in the classroom and our educational system, but they have not, in my observation, dramatically improved that situation. When I worked for RCA in labor relations, and I dealt with the union every day, I entered the workplace each day wondering what union officials I would do battle with that day and how I would beat them. And I know that many union officials enter the workplace every day knowing that they were going to do battle with me, but wondered on what issues and how they were going to beat me. In the non-union organizations, I entered the workplace every day wondering how we could make the workplace better and how we could better service a customer. And most of the employees entered the workplace every day with the same ideas in mind. Now I realize that sounds rather Pollyannish, but it was true. We didn't focus on conflict, we focused on the customer. Let me give you an example. When I was at RCA, we had a chief shop steward named Wes. Now, Wes was probably around 50 years old and had been with the company for many years and was always very active in the union. Some of the shop stewards and chief shop stewards I dealt with were not what I call good adversaries. They were not trustworthy, and they were more concerned with personal power than the benefits of the organization and employees. Many more were good adversaries in that we had healthy disagreements and we would be adversarial and civil at the same time. They could be trusted. Once again, sounds like real life, doesn't it? Wes was a good adversary, and Wes and I got along very well. I heard through the grapevine that Wes was very wealthy. I heard that he had more money than any executive we had in the company. I heard he owned several farms and several businesses. One day, in a relaxed moment, I asked him. He smiled and said, "Well, that's mostly true. I don't have any financial worries, and neither does my family." I asked him why then did he come to work every day and hassle with these problems? He smiled again and said 2 reasons. First, we have great benefits. Second, I just love coming in here and messing with management every day. I have more fun arguing with you and trying to beat you every day. Nothing like it. It becomes part of the culture and success falls down the list of priorities. What should you take from this story? Wes wasn't a bad person. He was just caught up in the culture, just like me. A culture created by the union. Well, not exactly. The union certainly had a hand in that culture, but so did management. Union-management relations means that both have a hand in the good and the bad. If unions push, management doesn't push back. The result, something not very pretty. Now, given that negative vision of a union environment, one must ask, why would employees want to have a union in their workplace? It's a valid question, and I believe it has a real simple answer. People don't vote for a union, they vote against management. In other words, management has done something at some point that has created distrust and negative feelings with employees. People don't vote for unions for more money or better benefits. Those are things that come along with a union, but people vote for unions to gain respect from management. Put another way, unions come into a company not because of what the union does, but because of what management does or doesn't do. The union promises to correct all of those perceived abuses, and employees vote them in because they see no other option. Think about it. Unions aren't free. They collect dues from employees. Management doesn't pay for unions, employees do. Why would employees vote to pay money for something they were already getting from management? It's a little like renting a house with all the appliances and going out and purchasing new appliances at your own expense, just like the ones your landlord provided. Why would you do such a thing? Because you don't trust those provided. When unions come into an organization, no need to look at the union and ask, what did they do? Look at management and ask, what did they do or not do? For the most part, organizations get unions because they deserve them. I believe the above position and have stated as much to many organizations on the verge of obtaining unions. However, there are some geographical areas of the country that have unions well ingrained in the culture, and good companies often inherit those unions. The Northeast and Midwest are examples discussed in the text. There are also companies who have had unions for decades and it becomes a part of doing business. But for the most part, organizations obtain unions because of indiscretions and incompetency of management. Now we know why companies obtain the attention of unions, but how do unions gain control? As indicated in the text, unions gain control through an election. The union targets the company, followed by an extensive campaign leading up to an election. The campaign is much like a political campaign, with each side laying out their case and courting the employees. The union normally has an organizing committee composed of employees in favor of the union. They actively campaign for union representation. Often there is a company committee composed of employees who are against the union and campaigning as such. There are big differences between the two groups other than their union orientation. The union organizing committee is appointed by the union without restrictions. The committee and the union itself can promise anything to employees. They do so through meetings and printed material. They promise more pay, benefits, vacation, fair treatment, etc. The company, on the other hand, cannot promise anything. See the section on tips in the text. Also, the company cannot provide any assistance to the committee against the union. The company cannot organize the committee, provide any financial support, or anything of value to assist in their campaign. This group often garners assistance from sources outside the company, such as community organizations, other companies in the area, etc. I have provided support to many such committees over time. My company was very interested in defeating unions in our community. Each union defeat discouraged other unions from investing time, money, and energy in a community that would not bear fruit. Each union victory invited other unions into the community. Understand, I was not concerned about losing a union election because we treated our employees well. However, fighting a campaign was always a huge distraction, and also it was financially expensive for the company. I knew if a union tried to organize our company, and they tried several times, they would fail. But ensuring the victory for our company was costly. Hence, I tried to discourage unions. So essentially, the union can promise anything, and the company can promise nothing. Also, as indicated by the TIPS acronym, the company cannot threaten, interrogate, or spy on employees. A friend of mine was an HR manager at a company involved in a union campaign. He and another management employee heard that there was some union activity in progress in the company parking lot. They went to investigate and in the process observed several employees discussing the union and handing out and receiving union literature. The union employees noticed the two management employees watching and filed an unfair labor practice charge for spying against them. The company narrowly won the election, and the union claimed that managers spying on employees caused some employees to vote for the company out of fear. The NLRB subsequently ruled that the election was unfair and vacated the results. They had to go through the whole election process again and subsequently lost by a few votes. TIPS is not something to be taken lightly. They are real restrictions with very heavy consequences. The election process is well documented in the text. If the union wins, both parties enter into negotiation. The time frame can be long or short. The law requires that both parties negotiate in good faith and provides some restrictions on items and issues to be negotiated, but there is no requirement that an agreement be reached. Once an agreement is reached, life changes. What is life like after the negotiations? Obviously, each company environment is different, but I can speak to life at RCA. The contract was king. The negotiated contract was several pages long and covered primarily work practices and policies. How to schedule vacation days, how to determine overtime preference, job posting and selection preferences, job assignments, etc. The contract was condensed down to a small booklet sized to fit into a pocket. Managers and union officials carried around the contract constantly for quick reference in case a decision had to be made. In other words, the contract was the basis for decision making and defined the restrictions and parameters of management and union employees. If management overstepped their bounds or appeared to overstep their bounds, a grievance was filed stating the violation and seeking a remedy. For example, if I, as a management employee, was walking through the facility and noticed a piece of paper on the floor and picked it up, I was in violation of management duties. I was doing the work of a housekeeping person. A grievance would have been filed, and the likely remedy would have been to pay 2 housekeeping employees 4 hours of overtime each for this breach of contract language. The dispute would be taken through the grievance process and perhaps negotiated down to 2 hours overtime each for 2 housekeeping employees. This was not an aberrant example. This was typical. From some of my comments thus far, one could argue that unions poison workplaces and workers. Unions change good, productive workplaces and workers into argumentative, bureaucratic, untrusting entities. I don't believe that either. Unions change cultures. They change cultures because that is what they intend to do. Let's face it, unions would have no success at all if they came into a company and stated, "We will leave everything just as it is." They would win no elections. Unions campaign on changing cultures. What they change the culture into has as much to do with management as it does with unions. I don't believe unions change people any more than moving into a different house changes people. People stay the same. It is the life, structure, culture, and routine that changes. It is a fact that many non-union companies hesitate to hire former union workers. I've never believed that mere union membership should be criteria for not hiring someone. After all, I've been a member of a union too. While working at Nestle, a gentleman applied for a job as a maintenance mechanic. His credentials were excellent. However, we discovered that not only was he a member of a union as former employer, the former employer was a local company, he was instrumental in organizing the union organizing committee and getting the union into the facility. In other words, he was a ringleader. Now, keep in mind that it is against the law to exclude someone from hiring consideration based on prior union membership or affiliation. It was a touchy situation. I didn't want to hire a rebel-rouser under any circumstances. We were also worried about something mentioned in the text, salting. Now I'll let you read about that from the authors. I decided to interview him again and see if we could determine his mindset. The interview was relaxed and went well. Eventually he mentioned that he knew I was probably concerned about his prior union affiliation. I asked him to expand. He said he was originally for the union because management was so bad. However, he subsequently became disillusioned with the union and didn't believe they fully fulfilled their promises. He said he would probably vote for the union again in that company because of the shortcomings of management, and he was looking for a fresh start with a good company. Now, this is exactly what you would expect someone to say in his position, but I felt he was sincere. Against a lot of contrary advice, I hired him. And he was an excellent employee and eventually rose to team leader in maintenance. And when unions targeted us, and they did frequently because we were such a vocal opponent of unions in the community, he was a staunch ally to whom employees listened due to his well-known union background. So if an employee or employees show strong support for the union, can the company win them back? Can an organization overcome bad feelings and distrust and turn that questionable employee into a good employee? Absolutely. How do you do it? We'll go back to the basics of treating people right. At Nestle, we had an employee I'll call Carolyn who was absolutely pro-union. For some reason, she was almost obsessed with getting a union into our facility. We had a few such employees, and fortunately, very few. During some of the union targets, or probes, as we called them, Carolyn was always actively promoting the union. She would walk through the facility with union authorization cards hanging out of each pocket. I considered her a lost cause. One day, Carolyn's team leader and his boss, the superintendent, came to my office to talk about Carolyn. After some discussion, they announced that they felt she could be turned into the company's favor and were going to change her. I was surprised and told them I thought they were dreaming, but they had a plan and I encouraged them to go forward, but really didn't give them any encouragement that it would be successful. Once again, my superior intelligence proved to be completely wrong, and I went from smug to dumb. It wasn't overnight, but during the course of a few months, Carolyn changed. Her demeanor changed, her attitude changed. She became positive and cooperative, and all pretense of unionization changed. It was amazing. I asked her team leader and superintendent how they managed to change Carolyn's inside but leave the outside relatively untouched. They said it was simple. They set her down and indicated that they couldn't understand why she was so negative and pro-union. They just wanted to know what they had done wrong. And she told them, and they listened. They had several discussions, and primarily she wanted to be heard and felt that the company had a different agenda. We said we listened to employees, and I believe we did, but she didn't believe that. It wasn't the environment she thought it should be or the environment she was promised in her perception. Over time, an understanding was reached on both sides, and hence the change. I was amazed and impressed with these two managers' insight. I was amazed with Carolyn's honesty and willingness to compromise. During a subsequent union probe, Carolyn organized the anti-union committee of employees to ensure that a union didn't come in and change our culture. Remember, when discussing benefits, I asked them, that goes for employee behavior as well. I was content to shake my head and give up. Better managers would only settle for positive change. You see, Carolyn's perception of the environment was different than mine and others. It's not about managers actually abusing employees. It is about the perception of abuse. One bad manager can spoil the perception of all management. Unions deal with perceptions, not necessarily reality. It is extremely important that leaders deal with perceptions as well. Perceptions are reality, especially in this day and time. So where does this discussion about unions leave us? I don't know about you, but it leaves me at the same place as when I walked in. I'm still biased against unions. I think in large measure they have outlived their effectiveness. I haven't talked myself out of my bias, but hopefully it leaves you with a different perspective of unions and management relations. Perhaps I am less against unions than I am the distorted view of business reality that frequently develops when you put unions and management together in the same cage. I'm not against lions and I'm not against lambs, but I'm not real fond of the environment that is created when we put lions and lambs together. It's messy at best and totally dysfunctional at worst. When unions and management are chained together in a contract, it is likewise messy at best and dysfunctional at worst. And referring back to Chapter 15, when unions enter the environment, employees and employers must give up some rights so that the union can function. What is interesting is that giving up their rights is voluntary on the part of employees and employers. Both groups choose to give up rights to the unions, and the unions gladly accept them. Finally, we have finished the last chapter. I hope this class has given you some insight into human resource management, and that my observations, thoughts, and yes, even my biases have contributed to you developing your own perspective on business in general. If we have accomplished that much, then we have both been successful. There is nothing like the feeling of success, especially when the ordeal is over. I hope it hasn't been too much of an ordeal. I hope that at some time down the road you were able to recall something from this class and I can contribute to you like Mr. Honda contributed to me. Good luck to each of you in your future journeys.